You got to hear me sing, and now you're going to hear me preach. And we start our series on Christian freedom tonight, and I'm excited to be presenting the first message in that series. The key really is that last sentence in that passage from Galatians. What is important is faith expressing itself in love, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But first, I want to ask you, I have some bad news for you tonight. I also have some good news. Which one do you want first? Good news. Well, before we get into that, let's start with a story. It's story time. I feel like I'm doing a kid's sermon already. There used to be an all-you-can-eat buffet in Toledo. That's where I grew up, in Toledo, Ohio. And when I was a kid, this place was called the Sweden House. Now, I had heard about this place, but I thought surely this was a rumor. Surely no place would let you eat everything you wanted. It was my dream come true. This was before there was a Golden Corral or Old Country Buffet or any of those places, at least in Toledo. But after our 8th grade trip to the Toledo Art Museum, we went there to eat. And it was real. And it was as glorious as I'd hoped. But being a big eater and someone who enjoys all kinds of food, I was in heaven. I ate until I was full. And then I ate some more just for good measure because I could. But there was one problem, the bus ride home. I sat in the back of the bus, and if you remember anything about riding in the back of a bus, or even the church van, you know that's where you really feel all the bumps. Not a great place to sit when your stomach is full of greasy, deep-fried food. So I felt sick, and although I kept my food down, thankfully, it was the most miserable I'd ever been. My freedom to eat anything I had wanted had taught me a valuable lesson that unabashed, unrestrained freedom isn't really a great thing. It seems like it a lot of the time. But in the context of the Christian life, there are rules. Now, one of my favorite song lines comes from a classic Jim Croce tune. You might know it. You don't tug on Superman's cape. You don't spit into the wind. You don't pull the mask off the Lone Ranger, and you don't mess around with Jim. Anybody remember that song? So in the song, Jim was a pretty rough character, and everyone knew in the neighborhood not to cross him. It was good advice. Now, there's a quote that has been attributed to various people and mutated through various forms, but here's the gist of it. A train is free only so long as it stays on its tracks. A train that jumps the tracks is free of the rails, to be sure, but no longer free in the most important sense of the world. It's a freed wreck that can't go anywhere. It's free, but no longer truly free, because it can't go where it was meant to go. So what I learned from my first buffet experience was that without limits, without some guide rails or something like that, I took from myself a very important freedom, and that was the freedom to feel good. To go play with my friends, to go home and watch TV and not feel miserable, to finish my homework without feeling like I'd been hit by a truck full of mashed potatoes. Now, for Christians, there is law, and there are rules. And following the rules doesn't save you from sin, of course, but like a train off the tracks, you'll miss the whole experience of how God has designed you to be if you don't engage in the idea of the law that has been given by God to his creation. Now, when Paul talks about the law in our epistle lesson for this evening, he's not just talking about the sometimes, at least to us, obscure Old Testament rules that maybe we're not that all familiar with. He's also talking about the commands that Jesus gave us. Now, we know that Jesus gave us commands, but we don't often refer to them as the law like we refer to the law of the Old Testament. But they really are, in a sense, the same thing. Because it's in those commands that we find great stuff to do, the ideal of how to live. It's good to want to do those things, but if we're honest with ourselves, we'd have to say that there is no way we can fully do them. I think we know that inherently. I think we just know that that is the truth. This is exactly why following the law can't save us, because we can't do it well enough to meet its stringent standards. To illustrate this, let's take, for example, probably the second most well-known command that Jesus gave us, and that is to love our neighbor as ourselves. Now, on the surface, boy, does this sound good. if only everyone loved their neighbor as themselves, right? Wouldn't the world be a better place? Surely we can do this one. We all pretty much agree that it's a good one, I think, but let's unpack that for a bit and lay bare the truth about what Jesus is really saying here. First, he's implying a truth, namely that you love yourself. That you love yourself. Now, there are folks who are the exception to that rule, I think, and some of us sometimes may engage in self-hate. There are mental issues sometimes that go along with that. It does happen. That's part of the human condition as well. But as a rule, we do love ourselves and do things to that end. Now notice the things that most of us do every day simply because we love ourselves. The first thing we do, usually, is feed ourselves, right? Sometimes to the point of being overfull, just like me at the Sweden House buffet. I wanted to give myself everything. We love ourselves, so we want to make ourselves feel good. And we have all kinds of ways to do this, and we engage in them quite frequently, usually unapologetically. We treat ourselves to things that maybe we don't need. We pay our bills so that we can live where we live. We own cars so that we can go where we want. We have jobs or retirement accounts so that we can take care of ourselves and maybe, hopefully, the people that we love if we need to as well. But what about the people that we don't necessarily love? At least in the way we love our family and close friends. Which brings us to a question that's pretty easy to answer. Who is our neighbor? This is an easy one. Our neighbor is everyone, every single person on this planet. So do we really, or can we even, really love our neighbor as ourselves? To put it bluntly, is the condition of our neighbor as important as the condition of ourselves? Are they equal to us in our mind? Do we feed and clothe the neighbor like we feed and clothe ourselves? We buy ourselves cars and homes and gifts and nice things that we splurge on sometimes. Do we do that for the neighbor the way we do it for ourselves? And I think we just have to be honest and say, no, we don't. That doesn't make us terrible people or anything, because it's out of the scope and realm of probably most of our budgets to do so. We might do things for our neighbor, to be sure. We do them as a church and individually, but are they on the same level as those things we would do for ourselves? After all, the commandment is, to not be too pedantic here, but to love your neighbor as yourself. And someone playing devil's advocate might say, do you really think God expects us to do that? And I think the answer is both yes and no. Yes, in that God is expecting sacrificial love from us to our fellow creation. No, in that he knows we're just not going to be up to the task. I love the story of Peter in the Gospels when he denies Christ. Now, it might seem like an odd story to love, but how it ends is really illustrative of the great grace and freedom we have in Christ. The story is pretty familiar. Jesus is headed toward the cross. Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times after Jesus is arrested. And of course, Peter was also the one who said, I'll never desert you, Lord. But this denial should put Peter on the naughty list, right? That's only fair. The good news is that our God is not fair. We don't serve a fair God. Now, admittedly, it's not great. Peter should know better, right? Even when the chips are down, he should know better than to do this. But the curious thing about this story is that Peter goes on to preach the sermon at Pentecost, where thousands hear the gospel message and give their lives to Christ. See, the story of Peter really is the story of us all. We can't measure up to the ideal God has given. We contrast him saying, I'll never desert you, Lord, with, I tell you, I don't know the man. Which is it? But contrast love your neighbor as yourself with, most of the things that I do for myself, and I don't share them with my neighbor. And when you unpack it like this, you see the vast wisdom, but also the vast commitment Jesus is calling for when he says, take up your cross and deny yourself. It means something far more dire than maybe we're willing to admit. It's a sacrifice we're not willing to make a lot of the time. And that, my friends, is the bad news. But here's the good news. God knows you can't do it. He gave you the vision of the ideal so that you could see how imperfect you are, which really sounds bad initially until you realize how good God is. He did that so you could understand why you needed saving in the first place. I mean, who can argue that loving your neighbor as yourself is a wonderful concept? Of course it is. And who can argue that it's not anything that we can do in totality? I mean, we try, we get bits and pieces of it here and there and cobble it together and do our best. But there's no way we can do it good enough to be perfect in living it out. And this is the good news, because this is good and true freedom. The freedom to mess it up. No, we don't go looking for opportunities to mess it up, of course, but we can fail and still be loved. Isn't that great freedom? A great burden lifted? It's funny that we have one of the best examples of this when we look at children, and yet we don't always apply it to our own lives. For example, I have this nagging question that I have never got an answer for. Why can't a baby drive a car? I want to see that. I mean, really, are they just not trying hard enough? No, they don't have the skills to do it. And we don't necessarily expect them to. They're just not to the point where they can do it yet. Paul says, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known." As the old song says, we'll understand it better by and by, but right now, we're not going to get it right. And we have a loving God who knows it and has done something about it, and that's what sets us free. Now, how does knowing that we're flawed make us free? The world might balk at such a suggestion, but think about it. If I know that I'm not going to live up to the great burden of the law, and yet I also know that I'm forgiven for not being able to do that, a great burden has been lifted off of my shoulders. I'm no longer weighed down by stuff that I couldn't possibly do perfectly. Do I want to get it right? Sure we do. It's a good thing to try, but no amount of trying could ever save me, because it's still trying. It's not arriving at the destination. It's forever wanting to get there. And boy, do we ever. We do want to do the good stuff at times because it's right, because it impacts the lives of those around us and it makes us feel good too. And that's what we're commanded to do. But no matter how much of that stuff we do, no matter how much we give, it couldn't possibly be enough. And that's okay. And for those of you who are burdened by sin, maybe even a particular sin tonight, I want you to hear that again. It's okay. It's not okay to not care about it, but it's okay. It's been paid for. It is finished. And that is true freedom. That's what it means to be truly free. You are free and ultimately forgiven for not doing all the stuff that God said you should do, right? Or maybe for doing some things that you shouldn't do. You're forgiven for not always taking up your cross and denying yourself. You're forgiven for not always loving your neighbor as yourself. You're forgiven for not loving your enemies and praying for those who persecute you. You're free from the punishment of not doing all those things to the letter of the law. And not only are you forgiven, but you are free to do the works that God has given you to do, that He has ordained beforehand for you to do. See, Jesus came to fulfill the law, and so that we'd be freed up to live a life unencumbered by the constraints of finding salvation and rule following. This story of Peter is one we know so well. In fact, maybe a little too well, it's lost a little of its impact. Peter goes from denier to preacher. This is no small thing. And the speed with which it happens is no small thing. It doesn't take Peter years and years of penance to be good enough to start preaching, to be used by God. No, Jesus reinstates him fairly quickly. It's a great testament to the power of forgiveness found only in Jesus. Forgiveness truly frees. So I want to ask you tonight, what is the burden that you can't let go of? During this Lent season, it's good to think about what is the thing that you did that you replay over and over in your mind, and you won't relinquish it to the blood of Christ. I have to tell you again that it's paid for. It's over. It's gone. It's forgiven. After all, are you going to be saved by applying the law to yourself over and over? No. Don't be held in bondage by something that's already been taken care of. It's always funny to me when people quibble over who is going to pay the bill when you go out to eat. Have you been in the middle of these conversations? Sometimes they seem endless. If someone offers to pick up the check, it's almost assumed that the other person will say, no, let me get that, right? And there's some back and forth before the person who said they paid initially ends up paying for it. This little back and forth is kind of a silly thing because we kind of know how it's going to end. It's a polite thing that we do, and that's not a terrible thing to do, of course, but it is the same way with us. We beat ourselves up over the smallest thing and feel guilty, or maybe it's a really big thing that seems too big to overcome, or we let really important stuff slide. On the other hand, so let me give you just a little advice this evening. Don't do the argument with Christ over who is picking up the tab for all that stuff, because he wins every time. And isn't it wonderful that we have a God who not only pays it, but leaves a sizable tip in the way that he blesses us on a daily basis? Live in that grace. I encourage you to hold it dear to your heart. Don't ever let the world's troubles take it away from you. In Jesus' name.